Hey everybody, it's Courtney. I'm here with a video for Trinity Stamps. Today I'm going to be using the stamp set that will actually be a freebie on Black Friday with qualifying purchases. I'm going to be making 3 pretty quick and simple cards. I'm going to be doing some backgrounds with my Distress Oxides. So I have Wilted Violet, Faded Jeans, Peacock Feathers, and Mermaid Lagoon. And I have taped a piece of Canson watercolor paper to, this is an old clipboard that I use, and I just stuck that down with some washi tape. I'm smushing my inks onto a Ranger craft mat here, and I have a pretty thick paintbrush here, and I'm adding a whole lot of water to my card panel there, and I will just start dropping in my color. I'm pretty much just dabbing it here and there and letting the water kind of take that color wherever it wants to go. All 3 blues I'm kind of just scattering throughout, letting them blend together, and then I will drop in that Wilted Violet just to kind of break up the blue. I'm taking a paper towel here just to kind of dab up some of the areas that are kind of pooling on the edges of the card panel. I used a ton of water. Even if you don't use a ton of water, sometimes you'll have some pooling, and this will give you some harsh lines when it dries. So I wasn't really too worried about this because I knew I'd be trimming this down anyway. But I did kind of pick up some of those puddles with a paper towel. I sprinkled on some clean water just to kind of help that blend out and spread out a little bit more. And then I'll take some shimmer spray, and you'll want to make sure that you really shake this up because all of the shimmer kind of settles to the bottom. But I'm just going to be using the nozzle there to splatter on a whole lot of shimmer spray. And I know it's hard to see when it's still wet, but this will, because it's still wet, it'll kind of spread as it dries, as the rest of the ink dries. So you can see that these lighten up quite a bit when they are dry, and I did the same technique for all 3 and they turned out completely different. So for the first card, I'm just going to be trimming off my white edges there from where my washi tape was. My paper trimmer, I had a little piece of adhesive stuck to my blade and it wasn't really cutting that well. But so this is going to be slightly smaller than an A2 size card. And I'm going to be using my Misty here and lining up my stamp right there in the center of my card panel. And I'm going to be splitting the sentiment up as far as the stamped colors that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to be using the Mermaid Lagoon for the top portion of the sentiment. And I'm just going to carefully try to stay away from that bottom word. And then I'll just take my chamois there just to kind of fix up any areas or any places that my blue may have gotten on that bottom word. I'll go ahead and stamp this down right onto my card panel there and clean off my stamp. And I did take my heat tool to my card panel because the Distress Oxides stay wet a lot longer and I knew I was going to be doing some heat embossing. I wanted to make sure that my ink was completely dry, as I didn't want, my embossing powder to stick to areas that I didn't want it to be. So once that was completely dry, I went ahead and aligned that back up into my Misty, treated that with my anti-static tool, and used my Versamark ink just to ink up that bottom word. I was trying to kind of look off to the side to see if I could line that up perfectly, but I couldn't. So I just kind of dabbed it on and then took my chamois to wipe off those areas on the top words. My stamp was a little damp from the chamois, and some of my words kind of bled there a little bit, but I wasn't too worried about it. Next, I sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and I will go ahead and heat set that. I did have to kind of brush away some of that stray embossing powder that stuck to the send word because that was still damp from my stamp chamois. The embossing powder will stick to it, but no big deal. I went ahead and put that aside, and we'll move on to the next card. And I'm going to be taking 2 stitched rectangle dies. One is a larger die and one is the 3rd to largest die. And I'm going to be die cutting these last 2 panels, one large, one small, as well as a piece of this bluish, purplish color cardstock as well with those same dies. I'm going to be stamping my sentiment in these smaller stitch rectangles. The sentiment fits perfectly in these. So for the watercolor panel, I'm going to be using that same Mermaid Lagoon, and I treated it with my anti-static tool. Stamp that down with that Mermaid Lagoon Distress Oxide inks. And now because Distress Oxides stay wet so long, you can emboss with them. So I'm going to take some clear embossing powder this time, sprinkle that on, and go ahead and heat set that, and I'll put that aside. Next, for the plain cardstock one, that purplish bluish cardstock, I'm going to basically be doing the same thing here. I'm going to line that up in my MISTI, and being my stamp is already lined up, I didn't have to move that around. Treated that with my anti-static tool, stamped that with my Versamark ink, and this time I'm going to be using some white embossing powder. I didn't get a great impression because the bottom of the stamp is so close to the bottom of the MISTI that it's hard to get a good impression when your stamp is that far down. So I realized once I was sprinkling on my white embossing powder that some of the letters on the bottom word there, the blizzard, didn't really stamp that well. So once it was heat set, I took an emboss-it pen and just kind of went over some of those areas that were missing some embossing powder. I'll sprinkle on a little bit more of that white embossing powder and heat set that, and you can't tell the difference. So last, we'll go ahead and assemble these cards. We'll start with the first one, and all I'm doing for this one is taking some fun foam and adhering that to the back of my card panel and popping that onto an A2 size note card. Now, I used score tape here because it's super, super sticky, and my paper was a little bit warped from all that water that I had used. And once this is down, it's down. So unfortunately, when I put it onto my card base itself, it was a little crooked. So no big deal. We can always fix it. It wasn't going to come up. So what I did was I ended up taking my paper trimmer and I just trimmed around it. I kind of eyeballed it. I didn't measure it at all, but just leaving a very small white border around the entire watercolor panel, I guess. And then I'll take my Tombow Mono multi-glue and adhere this to another A2 size card. It'll be a little bit thick, but it would be thick anyway because the watercolor paper is such a heavy weight. Next, for the final two cards, I'm going to assemble these pretty much the same way, just in reverse. I'm going to adhere my large stitched rectangle down flat to an A2 size note card with my Tombow Mono multi-glue, and then I will take some fun foam cut just slightly smaller than that middle panel there and stick that on. And this time I did use my Tombow Mono multi-glue just because it is a smaller area and it's not necessarily as warped. And I'll just center that on there and do the same thing with the other one, just kind of flipping everything around. Last, I wanted to add some embellishments to all three of my cards. So I'm taking the Frosty Snowflakes embellishments here, and I'm just going to scatter some around on the top right corner and on the bottom left hand corner, and I'll adhere these with my glossy accents. For this first card, I used the white and the light blue. For the second card, I used just the white, I believe, if I remember correctly. Yes. And for the final card, I kind of just mixed them up. There's like a dark blue, a light blue, and the white in here. And that is it for these three cards. I think this took me less than an hour for all three cards. So this is a great stamp to have if you're trying to kind of mass produce some of the Christmas cards when it gets down to crunch time. So thanks so much for stopping by, guys. Have a great day. Bye.